The room was stifling. A dim, flickering bulb swung overhead, buzzing with the kind of electric hum that seemed to mock the silence between screams. Samuel Kanyon Doe, once the feared president of Liberia, sat slumped in a metal chair. His uniform, once a symbol of power, was torn and bloodied. Around him, rebels in mismatched fatigues jeered, laughed, and sipped beer straight from the bottle. At the center of the chaos stood Prince Johnson, a man who had once served under Doe but now grinned like a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. It was September 9, 1990, and the world was about to witness a scene so brutal, so humiliating, that it would stain Liberia's history forever. Cameras were rolling. The tape of Doe's capture and torture would become one of the most infamous political death recordings in modern history. But how did a village boy who rose to become the most powerful man in Liberia end up here, broken, bleeding, and begging for his life? To answer that, we must go back 10 years earlier, to a night of gunfire, betrayal, and ambition. The coup that changed everything. April 12, 1980. The night was hot and sticky in Monrovia. Inside the executive mansion, President William R. Tolbert Jr., who had ruled Liberia for a decade, was preparing for bed. He could not have known that outside, a band of young soldiers, led by a 28-year-old Master Sergeant Samuel Kanyon Doe, was preparing to storm the gates. Doe was not a man born into privilege. He was from Grand Gate County, a rural region far from the Americo-Liberian elite who had controlled Liberia for more than 130 years. For most of the country's history, power belonged to descendants of freed American slaves, while indigenous Liberians were treated as second-class citizens. Doe was different. He was angry, ambitious, and he had the loyalty of men who believed it was time to end the Americo-Liberian monopoly. That night, with only a small group of heavily armed enlisted men, he struck. The assault was swift and merciless. Tolbert was killed, his guards cut down. Ministers were dragged from their homes, stripped, and executed on a Monrovia beach in front of television cameras. Liberians who had never imagined the downfall of the Americo-Liberians now watched in shock as young, battle-hardened soldiers declared themselves saviors. And at the head of it all was Samuel Kanyon Doe, the man who would go from hero to tyrant in less than a decade. The promise of redemption. At first, there was hope. The coup was celebrated by many Liberians who had long suffered under a rigid social system. For the first time, an indigenous man was leading the country. Doe styled himself as a man of the people, leader of the People's Redemption Council. He promised justice, equality, and a new Liberia where wealth and opportunity would not belong only to Americo-Liberians. But power has a way of corrupting quickly. Within months, the shine of liberation began to fade. Doe, a man with little formal education and no political training, quickly surrounded himself with loyalists from his own ethnic group, the Kron. Rivalries brewed. Instead of building a national government, Doe fortified his personal power. Those who opposed him vanished. Some were jailed, others executed. The redemption Liberia had hoped for was rapidly becoming something far darker. The iron grip tightens. By 1985, Doe had fully consolidated power. He held elections, but they were anything but free. Ballot boxes were stuffed, opposition candidates intimidated, and results blatantly falsified. When the dust settled, Doe declared himself the winner with just over 50% of the vote. Few believed the numbers, but fewer dared to question them openly. His paranoia grew. He feared plots everywhere, inside his government, his army, even his own friends. Doe's Liberia became a land where whispers could get you killed. Yet, oddly enough, he enjoyed the backing of the United States. To Washington, Doe was useful. At the height of the Cold War, Liberia was strategically important, hosting U.S. communication facilities and serving as a pro-American outpost in West Africa. The Reagan administration turned a blind eye to Doe's brutality, funneling millions in aid into his government, even as corruption drained it away. Critics began to whisper that Doe was more than just an ally. Some suspected he was a CIA asset, a pawn in America's chess game against Soviet influence. To his enemies, this made him untouchable, protected by the world superpower. But protection is not the same as invincibility. The seeds of war. Behind the scenes, resentment was boiling. The Americo-Liberians, still bitter about their loss of power, despised him. Rival ethnic groups, sidelined and persecuted, plotted revenge. His former allies, ambitious men like Charles Taylor and Prince Johnson, watched his every move with envy and hatred. By the late 1980s, Liberia was a powder keg. The economy had collapsed under mismanagement and theft. Salaries went unpaid, food grew scarce, and trust in Doe evaporated. Where he had once been seen as a liberator, he was now viewed as a dictator clinging desperately to power. And in the forests of neighboring Côte d'Ivoire, rebels were gathering. Armed, funded, and hungry for power, they waited for the right moment to strike. The irony of power. Samuel Doe often boasted of his rise from poverty to power. He called himself the president of the people, but his actions betrayed his words. The same man who once stormed the executive mansion in the name of freedom now built high walls around himself, insulated by bodyguards and fear. He had come to power by gunfire, and it was by gunfire that his fall would begin. Cliffhanger ending. On that September morning in 1990, as Prince Johnson leaned over the battered, bleeding body of the man he once called commander, Doe's eyes flickered with disbelief. He had outmaneuvered rivals, crushed coups, and held the loyalty of the world's most powerful nation. Yet here he was, stripped of all dignity, mocked by men who once saluted him. How did it unravel so fast? How did the man who promised to redeem Liberia become its greatest cautionary tale? The answers lie not just in betrayal, but in scandal, corruption, and the secret games of foreign powers. The first years after Samuel Doe's coup were a strange paradox. On the streets of Monrovia, some still hailed him as the liberator who had toppled the Americo-Liberian elite. But behind the walls of the executive mansion, a different picture was unfolding. Doe had tasted power, and like bitter wine, it burned his throat but left him craving more. He ruled not with the humility of a village boy who had risen against the odds, but with the paranoia of a man who trusted no one and feared everyone. From soldier to strongman. Samuel Doe was not a politician. He was a soldier who had stumbled into power with a gun in his hand and adrenaline in his veins. Governance, diplomacy, nation-building, these were alien concepts. What he understood was control, and control came through fear. His People's Redemption Council, initially a collection of young soldiers who had marched with him on the night of the coup, soon became nothing more than a rubber stamp for his will. Ministers who questioned him disappeared. Generals who grew too ambitious were executed in plots that may have been imagined more than real. By 1983, Doe had transformed from revolutionary leader into something far more dangerous, a paranoid dictator who saw betrayal lurking in every shadow. Ethnic divide, Liberia splits. Perhaps his most fatal mistake was the weaponization of ethnicity. Doe was Kron, and he made sure the Kron people became the backbone of his power. He filled the army with Kron loyalists, ensuring that key command positions were held by his tribesmen. Civil service jobs, contracts, and opportunities flowed disproportionately to his ethnic group. For Liberia's other tribes, the Geo, the Mano, the Mandingo, the Bassa, resentment boiled. Many felt not only excluded but actively persecuted. Stories spread of soldiers targeting Geo and Mano communities, of arbitrary arrests, of beatings in the name of loyalty to Doe. It was not just politics anymore. It was survival. To many Liberians, Doe's rule began to feel less like a government and more like an ethnic cartel. And when a leader builds walls of tribe and fear around himself, he builds, too, the seeds of his downfall. The 1985 elections, democracy in disguise. By the mid-1980s, pressure was mounting from abroad. The United States, which had invested heavily in Doe, was facing criticism for supporting a regime widely seen as brutal and corrupt. Washington wanted a show of democracy, something to justify its millions in aid. And so, in 1985, Liberia went to the polls. Or rather, it pretended to. Opposition candidates were harassed, their rallies disrupted, their supporters arrested. On election day, ballot boxes mysteriously disappeared, votes were altered, and results were delayed for days. When the final tally was announced, Doe had won with just over 50% of the vote, conveniently enough to avoid a runoff. International observers laughed behind closed doors. Liberians raged openly. But the U.S. government, eager to preserve its strategic outpost, congratulated Doe and kept the money flowing. The irony was bitter. A man who had come to power through bloodshed now cloaked himself in the trappings of democracy, even as he mocked the very idea of it. A country devoured by corruption. If Liberia had been poor before, under Doe it became destitute. Aid money vanished into offshore accounts. Government officials became overnight millionaires. Doe himself was rumored to stash millions in foreign banks, even as schools collapsed, hospitals lacked medicine, and soldiers went unpaid. Civil servants began demanding bribes for even the most basic services. Liberia's economy, once propped up by rubber exports and foreign investment, fell apart. The streets of Monrovia filled with hungry children and angry men. One American diplomat at the time described Liberia as a banquet where only the elites eat while the rest watch from the windows, starving. And at the head of the table sat Samuel Doe, devouring everything he could. The cult of fear. What corruption could not buy, violence enforced. Doe's security forces became notorious for their brutality. Dissidents were dragged from their homes in the dead of night. Opposition journalists were beaten, imprisoned, or silenced. One chilling story tells of a university student who dared to question Doe in a public forum. Days later, his body was found floating in the Mesurado River, his hands bound, his face beaten beyond recognition. Doe's Liberia became a land where fear whispered louder than hope. Friends turned to foes. But the most dangerous cracks were forming not among ordinary Liberians, but among Doe's own allies. Charles Taylor, once an official in Doe's government, fled the country after being accused of embezzlement. In exile, Taylor began plotting revenge, building a network of rebels that would later return with fire and fury. Prince Johnson, another ambitious soldier, watched Doe's paranoia with growing contempt. To him, Doe was not a leader but a tyrant who had lost touch with reality. Even within the Crown-dominated army, discontent simmered. Doe's favoritism and his refusal to share true power meant that loyalty was paper-thin. The stage was being set. Allies were becoming enemies. And enemies were becoming executioners. The U.S. connection. Here's where the story becomes scandalous. Despite the corruption, the brutality, and the sham elections, the United States kept its arm around Doe's shoulder. Why? Because Liberia was too important. Its capital hosted Voice of America transmitters, intelligence gathering stations, and one of the largest U.S. embassies in Africa. Some insiders whispered that Doe was not just an ally, but an asset, shielded because he served American interests. And here lies the bitter twist: the very support that kept him in power also deepened the hatred against him. To many Liberians, Doe was not just a dictator, he was a puppet. The calm before the storm. By the late 1980s, Liberia was a nation on the edge. The economy was ruined. Ethnic divisions had hardened into hostility. Rebels were gathering just across the border, armed and waiting. And inside the executive mansion, Samuel Doe, once a village boy turned liberator, now lived like a prisoner of his own paranoia. He slept surrounded by bodyguards, his meals tasted for poison, his ears always listening for whispers of betrayal. The irony was cruel. The man who had risen by killing a president now lived in fear of the same fate. And fate, as Liberia would soon learn, was preparing to collect its debt. Cliffhanger ending. The question was no longer if Samuel Doe would fall, but how. Would it be a coup from within his own army? A rebellion from the jungles? Or a betrayal from the very foreign powers that had once protected him? By the late 1980s, Liberia was a nation under siege, not just from rebels in the jungle, but from shadows in every corridor of power. Samuel Doe's paranoia wasn't entirely misplaced. Betrayal was brewing everywhere. His enemies were multiplying, both inside his own ranks and across the borders. And what made it even more dangerous? Many of these enemies had once been his allies. Charles Taylor, the exiled mastermind. Few figures loom as large in Doe's downfall as Charles Kanyon Taylor. Once a member of Doe's government, Taylor had been appointed to oversee government procurement. It was a position with access to vast sums of money. But in 1983, Doe accused him of embezzling nearly $1 million. Taylor fled to the United States, only to be arrested and detained in a Massachusetts jail. And then, mysteriously, Taylor escaped, slipping through the cracks of U.S. custody and vanishing like smoke. To this day, his escape is shrouded in scandal. How does a high-profile prisoner accused of international theft simply walk out of an American jail? Some whisper that it wasn't an escape at all, but a release. Others suggest Taylor was being groomed, perhaps even supported, to one day play a larger role in West Africa. By 1989, Taylor had resurfaced across the border in Côte d'Ivoire, leading the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL. He was charismatic, ruthless, and backed by powerful patrons. His mission was simple: overthrow Samuel Doe. Prince Johnson, the ambitious rebel. But Taylor wasn't Doe's only nightmare. Another figure was rising, Prince Yormi Johnson. Johnson had once been part of Taylor's NPFL, but ambition is a dangerous companion. He broke away, forming his own faction, the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, INPFL. To Doe, this meant facing not one, but two rebel leaders, each eager to claim Liberia for himself. And Johnson had something Taylor lacked: raw, unpredictable brutality. He was theatrical, charismatic in a terrifying way, and deeply personal in his vendettas. Where Taylor plotted like a chess master, Johnson struck like a cobra. It would be Johnson who ultimately captured Doe, but in these years before the fall, Doe underestimated just how dangerous this former ally would become. The whispers of betrayal. Inside Doe's government, betrayal had become a silent epidemic. Ministers who had once pledged loyalty now whispered with opposition figures. Generals, angered by Doe's favoritism toward the crown, quietly weighed whether they should strike first before he turned on them. Doe responded the only way he knew how: through purges. Suspected traitors were executed without trial. Entire communities accused of harboring rebels were punished. But each act of repression only deepened the hatred. Each execution created widows and orphans who longed for revenge. Liberia was becoming not a country, but a cauldron of vengeance. The U.S. dilemma. All the while, the United States faced its own crisis of conscience. To abandon Doe meant losing a strategic ally in West Africa. To support him meant being complicit in his atrocities. Officially, Washington called for reform. Unofficially, money still flowed into Doe's coffers. American officials visited Monrovia, shook his hand, and smiled for the cameras, even as their intelligence officers quietly filed reports warning that Doe's days were numbered. And here lies the scandal no one dares to say out loud. Some Liberians believe that Washington knew exactly how Samuel Doe would fall. Some even whisper that his enemies, Taylor and Johnson, had received more than just moral encouragement from foreign hands. Was Doe's death the price of convenience for the West? A quiet removal of a dictator who had outlived his usefulness? The truth may never be fully known, but the suspicions remain. The first shots of war. On Christmas Eve, 1989, Charles Taylor's forces stormed across the border from Côte d'Ivoire into Liberia. They were a ragtag army of rebels, but their arrival marked the beginning of Liberia's civil war. At first, Doe laughed it off. He called them bandits, criminals who would be crushed within days. But as the weeks passed, it became clear, Taylor's rebellion was no joke. Villages fell, government soldiers deserted, and Taylor's forces grew stronger. By mid-1990, the NPFL controlled much of Liberia. Only Monrovia, fortified by Doe's army, remained firmly in his grip. But even the capital was not safe. Inside Monrovia itself, Prince Johnson's INPFL lurked, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Liberia in flames. The fighting was brutal. Civilians were massacred by both sides. Ethnic cleansing campaigns tore communities apart, Kron against Geo, Geo against Kron. Families fled into the jungle, hunted by rebels or harassed by soldiers. Monrovia became a city of ghosts, its streets filled with corpses and smoke. And still, Doe clung to power, insisting he was in control, even as the walls closed in. His paranoia deepened. He trusted fewer and fewer men, isolating himself in the executive mansion. His decisions grew erratic. He ordered mass arrests, executed suspected informants, and lashed out at the very people who might have helped him survive. The president who had once stormed the gates now lived like a prisoner, surrounded by bodyguards who wondered whether they were protecting him, or waiting for their chance to betray him. The foreign stakeholders. Meanwhile, foreign interests circled like vultures. Côte d'Ivoire quietly supported Taylor. Burkina Faso offered training grounds. Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, armed and trained many of the rebels, seeing in them an opportunity to spread influence in West Africa. Even Nigeria, Liberia's powerful neighbor, watched carefully, its government weighing whether to intervene or let Doe collapse. The war was no longer just Liberia's, it was becoming a proxy battlefield for regional and global powers. And in the middle of this storm sat Samuel Doe, still believing he could hold on to power, still convinced that betrayal came only from outside, never realizing how close it already was. The gathering storm. By August 1990, the noose had tightened. Rebels closed in on Monrovia. Doe's army was exhausted, demoralized, and divided. Food and medicine were scarce. International aid organizations reported atrocities on all sides, but the stories of Doe's brutality began to outweigh even those of the rebels. The man who had risen as a liberator now faced his own liberation, one he would not survive. Cliffhanger ending. The stage was set. Charles Taylor's NPFL wanted the throne. Prince Johnson's INPFL wanted the glory. The United States, Liberia's longtime ally, remained silent. And Samuel Doe? He still clung to his chair, unaware that soon it would not be a seat of power, but the very chair in which he would beg for his life. The first raindrops of war had already fallen on Liberia. By mid-1990, the drizzle had turned into a storm, and soon the whole nation would drown in blood. Samuel Doe, the once celebrated liberator, was now trapped in his own capital, surrounded by enemies, abandoned by allies, and hunted by men who wanted not just his power, but his life. Taylor's Jungle Army. Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL, grew with terrifying speed. At first, they were only a few hundred fighters slipping across the border from Côte d'Ivoire. But within months, they had thousands. How? Because they weren't just fighting with guns, they were fighting with promises. Taylor told Liberians that Doe's regime was finished, that justice for years of Crown favoritism was finally at hand. For every Geo and Mano who had suffered under Doe's security forces, Taylor offered revenge. His forces swept across towns and villages. Each victory swelled his ranks with fresh recruits, some driven by anger, some by hunger, and others by fear. Taylor promised to march straight to Monrovia and seize the presidency. But Charles Taylor had not counted on his old comrade, Prince Johnson. The prince breaks away. Prince Yormi Johnson had fought alongside Taylor in the NPFL. Together they had dreamed of toppling Doe. But Johnson was impatient, ambitious, and unwilling to take orders. So, in 1990, he broke away and formed the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, INPFL. It was a smaller force, but Johnson made up for numbers with raw brutality. He carved his own path into Monrovia, and soon the capital was caught in a deadly triangle: Doe's army, Taylor's NPFL, and Johnson's INPFL, each fighting the other, each desperate to be the one to capture the crown. For Samuel Doe, it was a nightmare. His enemies weren't just outside his walls, they were multiplying like shadows at dusk. Monrovia in chaos. By the summer of 1990, Monrovia was a city on fire. Mortar shells rained down. Gunfire echoed through empty streets. The once bustling markets were abandoned, their stalls filled not with food, but with corpses. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire. Families huddled in churches, schools, and hospitals, hoping the fighting would pass them by. But the war was merciless. Soldiers, government or rebel, looted homes, killed indiscriminately, and dragged young men away to fight or die. A city that had once been called the Athens of West Africa was now a war zone. Inside the executive mansion, Doe tried to project confidence. He appeared on state radio, declaring that the rebels would be crushed, that his army remained loyal. But his words were hollow. Every day, more of his soldiers deserted. Every week, another district fell to rebel control. The Americans watch. And where was Liberia's most powerful ally? The United States watched from the sidelines. The U.S. Embassy in Monrovia became a fortress, surrounded by sandbags and guarded by Marines. American diplomats knew Doe was finished. They had intelligence reports detailing rebel advances, reports warning of his imminent fall. Yet Washington remained silent. For years, they had propped him up. Now, as the storm gathered, they offered no umbrella. Some Liberians whispered that the Americans were waiting for Doe to die, that his usefulness had expired, and his removal was not a tragedy, but a convenience. Whether true or not, Doe felt the sting of betrayal. The same superpower that once called him our man in Monrovia now left him to fight alone. The battle for the capital. By August, the fighting reached a fever pitch. Taylor's NPFL had encircled Monrovia, cutting off supplies and choking the city into submission. Johnson's INPFL launched raids, striking both Doe's soldiers and Taylor's fighters. Doe's Kron-dominated army was cornered but still dangerous. They fought desperately to hold key positions, the executive mansion, the port, and the main roads leading into the city. But the cost was unbearable. Thousands of civilians were slaughtered in massacres that shocked the world. The St. Peter's Lutheran Church massacre became a symbol of the horror. Hundreds of men, women, and children, mostly from the Geo and Mano tribes, murdered by soldiers loyal to Doe. The massacre destroyed whatever sympathy remained for his government. To the world, Samuel Doe was no longer a president under siege, he was a butcher clinging to power. Ecomog enters the scene. As Monrovia bled, regional powers finally acted. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, formed a peacekeeping force known as Ecomog, led by Nigeria. Their mission was to stop the bloodshed, protect civilians, and stabilize Liberia. But the arrival of Ecomog only added another player to the battlefield. Taylor saw them as an obstacle, Johnson as an opportunity, and Doe as a potential lifeline. For a brief moment, Doe believed Ecomog might save him. If the Nigerians could secure the port and the airport, maybe, just maybe, he could survive. But what he didn't know was that his enemies were already plotting a trap that no foreign force could prevent. The desperate gambit. With his city collapsing around him, Doe made one last gamble. He decided to meet with Ecomog leaders at the free port of Monrovia. He believed he was walking into diplomacy, into protection, into a chance to negotiate survival. But it was a fatal miscalculation. For waiting at the free port, hidden among the chaos of soldiers and shipping containers, was a man who wanted his head, literally. Prince Johnson had prepared his moment. As Doe's convoy rolled toward the port, he thought he was heading into safety. In reality, he was driving into the jaws of his enemy. The air in Monrovia smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and fear. By September 1990, Liberia's capital was a city under siege. Rebel factions fought in the streets, corpses lay rotting in gutters, and hungry civilians scavenged for scraps in what was once the jewel of West Africa. Samuel Doe, trapped in his shrinking fortress of power, had convinced himself there was still a way out. He believed diplomacy could save him, that if he met with West African peacekeepers, he might secure protection, or at least buy himself more time. It was a fatal mistake. The Freeport meeting. On September 9, 1990, Doe set out for the Freeport of Monrovia. His convoy of heavily armed soldiers moved slowly through the wreckage of a city still echoing with distant gunfire. The meeting was meant to be with Ecomog, the Nigerian-led peacekeeping force that had just landed. Doe believed they might secure his survival. Perhaps, if the Nigerians could shield him, he could outlast Taylor's NPFL and Johnson's INPFL. But Doe was walking into a trap. Waiting in the shadows was Prince Johnson, the man who had once fought under Taylor but now sought his own throne. Johnson knew that capturing Doe alive would give him something even Taylor did not have, absolute proof of victory. The ambush. As Doe's convoy entered the port, the world seemed to tilt. Gunfire erupted. Soldiers scrambled. Chaos filled the air as Prince Johnson's fighters sprang from hiding places, cutting off Doe's men. The president, stunned and furious, tried to fight back. His guards fired in all directions, but they were outnumbered, outflanked, and overwhelmed. Within minutes, the once feared leader of Liberia, the man who had executed a president, ruled with an iron fist, and defied foreign powers, was dragged from his car. Bloodied, beaten, and stripped of his dignity, Samuel Doe was now a prisoner. The streets of Monrovia had seen many betrayals, but none as dramatic as this. The mockery of power. Prince Johnson wasted no time. He paraded his captive before the cameras. For Johnson, it wasn't enough to kill Doe, he wanted to humiliate him, to strip away every shred of power before the world's eyes. In a dingy room, rebels tied Doe to a chair. Cameras rolled. The once mighty president begged for mercy as his captors laughed, sipped beer, and asked mock questions as if they were hosting a grotesque game show. Prince Johnson sat casually in a chair, sipping from a Budweiser can, as Doe's ears were sliced off one by one. The cameras caught every scream, every drop of blood, every desperate plea. It was a performance of cruelty, a political theater designed not just to end a man, but to send a message. Samuel Doe, the Iron Ruler, was finished. Monrovia watches. The news of Doe's capture spread like wildfire. For some Liberians, it was justice long overdue. Here was the man who had massacred their people, who had stolen their wealth, now reduced to a pleading prisoner. But for others, it was a chilling sign of what Liberia had become, a land where vengeance was celebrated, and brutality was broadcast like entertainment. And the irony was brutal. Samuel Doe, who had once executed his enemies on Monrovia's beaches in front of television cameras, now faced the same fate, this time with videotape rolling for the world to see. The flames of ethnic hatred. Doe's capture did not end the violence, it inflamed it. His Kron soldiers, enraged and desperate, launched retaliatory attacks on civilians suspected of supporting Taylor or Johnson. Taylor's NPFL, in turn, intensified its massacres of Kron communities. The war had slipped beyond politics. It was now a war of tribe against tribe, vengeance against vengeance. And Monrovia burned. The Lutheran Church massacre had already horrified the world, but in the days following Doe's capture, killings multiplied. Streets became rivers of blood. Families fled in every direction, only to find that death lurked everywhere, at checkpoints, in villages, in fields. Liberia's capital, once a city of learning and culture, had become a graveyard. The Americans stay silent. And through it all, the United States remained curiously silent. Marines protected their embassy, evacuating American citizens, but offered no rescue for the man they had once propped up as our man in Monrovia. Rumors swirled. Had Washington known Doe would be captured? Did they allow it to happen? Some whispered that Doe had been abandoned because he was no longer useful, that his death was not a tragedy, but a strategic convenience. The scandalous silence fueled debate that lingers to this day. Was Samuel Doe betrayed not only by his own people, but by the very superpower that had once been his lifeline? The longest hours. For hours, Prince Johnson's men tormented Doe. They sliced at his flesh, taunted him, and demanded confessions of crimes he could no longer deny. Each moment was captured on tape, a grotesque chronicle of humiliation. At one point, Doe tried to offer Johnson money, millions hidden in foreign accounts, in exchange for his life. But Johnson laughed. "Your money is nothing," he sneered, sipping his beer as his men pressed the knife deeper. It was not ransom Johnson wanted. It was dominance. The city collapses. Outside that dark room, Monrovia descended further into chaos. Johnson and Taylor's forces clashed violently, each determined to claim the spoils of victory. Civilians were trapped in between, fleeing from one rebel faction only to stumble into another. Hunger and disease spread faster than bullets. The storm that Samuel Doe had unleashed a decade earlier with his coup had now consumed not only him, but the very nation he swore to redeem. As night fell, Samuel Doe still clung to life, his body mutilated, his power stripped, his fate sealed. But the storm was far from over. His torture would continue into the night, his screams echoing through Monrovia, a haunting reminder that in Liberia, power was never given, it was taken, and it was always taken by blood. The sound of laughter and screams echoed through the port compound. A dictator was being dismantled piece by piece, and the whole world was about to watch. Prince Johnson had captured not just a man, but a moment in history. And he knew exactly how to use it. The room of pain. The room where Samuel Doe sat bound to a chair was hot, crowded, and filled with the smell of sweat, blood, and cheap beer. His hands were tied behind him, his uniform ripped to shreds, his once proud frame reduced to a shivering mess. Around him stood a circle of young, trigger-happy rebels, men barely out of their teens. Some held knives, others carried AK-47 slung casually over their shoulders. Their eyes gleamed with a mix of vengeance and amusement. And then there was Prince Johnson, calm, collected, almost theatrical. While his men jeered and cut into Doe's body, Johnson reclined in a chair, a Budweiser in one hand, casually directing the performance like a conductor of a cruel orchestra. The tape begins to roll. Johnson had done something that made this moment uniquely scandalous. He ordered it to be filmed. Why? Because in Liberia, power wasn't only about guns. It was about narrative. To kill Doe was one thing, to show the world his suffering was another. By taping the torture, Johnson created propaganda, proof that the man who once ruled Liberia with an iron fist had been reduced to begging for his life. The tape showed Doe, sweat pouring down his face, his voice trembling as he pleaded. Please, let me go. We can talk. I have money. I can give you everything." But Johnson's men laughed. They weren't there for money. They were there for blood. One rebel sliced off Doe's ear while Johnson, sipping his beer, asked mock questions. "Mr. President, where are the millions you stole from Liberia?" It was grotesque theater, half interrogation, half comedy skit, all drenched in violence. The irony of power. There was a brutal irony in this scene. Samuel Doe himself had once reveled in public executions. In 1980, after his coup, he had tied members of the old regime to poles on the beach and shot them before cheering crowds. Now, a decade later, he was the one tied, beaten, and humiliated, while his enemies laughed and filmed. The cycle of vengeance in Liberia had come full circle, and it was recorded in blood. The mock confessions. As the torture dragged on, Johnson demanded that Doe confess to his crimes. "Tell the Liberian people what you did. Tell them how you killed. Tell them how you stole." Doe, desperate, tried to appease his captors. He admitted to corruption, to killings, to hoarding money in foreign banks. His words spilled out like blood from an open wound, not because he wanted to confess, but because he thought it might save him. But Johnson had no intention of sparing him. The confessions weren't for truth, they were for theater, a way to strip Doe of any remaining dignity. A nation watches in horror. When the tape eventually leaked, it shocked the world. Diplomats, journalists, and ordinary Liberians watched in horror as the once mighty president screamed and bled on screen. Some cheered, saying justice had finally come. Others wept, not for Doe, but for the soul of Liberia. If a president could be tortured like this, what hope was there for anyone else? And yet, the tape served its purpose. Prince Johnson had seized not just a man, but the narrative. He had humiliated his rival so completely that his own name became synonymous with power. For a brief moment, Johnson overshadowed Charles Taylor himself. The scandal of silence. What stunned many was the silence that followed. International powers condemned the violence, but none intervened. The United States, which had supported Doe for years, issued statements of concern, but nothing more. No rescue attempt, no military strike, no justice for their former ally. To Liberians, it seemed like betrayal. America had built Doe up, used him as a Cold War pawn, then abandoned him the moment he was no longer useful. Some whispered that Washington knew of the plot and chose to let it happen. Whether true or not, the scandalous silence left a bitter legacy. Johnson's calculated risk. By filming the torture, Johnson had taken a gamble. He knew it would horrify some, but he also knew it would cement his reputation as a man not to be trifled with. For his followers, the tape was proof of victory. For his enemies, it was a warning: cross Prince Johnson, and you will not just die, you will die in humiliation. It was savage branding, the kind of brutal advertisement only a warlord could conceive. But it came at a price. Many Liberians began to see Johnson as a monster, no different from the man he had killed. His cruelty, captured on film, would forever define him. The slow death of Samuel Doe. For hours, the torment continued. Doe's body grew weaker with every cut, every slap, every taunt. His blood pooled on the floor. His words slurred. His cries faded to whispers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the inevitable happened. Samuel Kanyon Doe, the soldier who rose from the barracks to the presidency, the man who ruled Liberia with fear, died not with dignity, but with laughter ringing in his ears. The dictator was gone, but the war was far from over. Prince Johnson thought the tape would secure his power. But Liberia was a land of shifting loyalties, and Charles Taylor was still waiting in the wings. Killing Doe was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of something even darker, a conflict that would drag Liberia into years of blood, fire, and betrayal. Samuel Kanyon Doe was dead. His body had been discarded, his screams silenced, yet his presence lingered over Monrovia like a specter. The capital was still aflame, the streets riddled with corpses, and the air thick with the smoke of burning homes and businesses. But in the world of warlords, a fallen king does not end a conflict, he only opens the door for new contenders. Power vacuums are dangerous. When Doe died, he left behind more than a bleeding city, he left a vacuum. The man who had ruled with iron fists had also maintained a fragile, if brutal, order. His death tore that order apart. Crowned soldiers, leaderless and enraged, attempted to regroup and defend enclaves of Monrovia, but without Doe's command, discipline collapsed. Many abandoned their posts. Others turned to looting. Civilian neighborhoods became frontlines overnight. Families who had survived Doe's tyranny now faced a terrifying new reality. No one was in charge, and survival meant running, hiding, or dying. Prince Johnson's moment. Prince Johnson, having captured and executed Doe, now held the city's most potent symbol, victory over Liberia's most feared dictator. But the triumph was fleeting. Johnson's INPFL was small compared to Taylor's NPFL, which controlled vast swaths of the countryside. Johnson could celebrate Doe's death, but he could not hold Liberia alone. And more importantly, he could not escape Taylor's wrath. Charles Taylor, the master strategist. Charles Taylor, observing from the forests outside Monrovia, understood something critical. Johnson's fame after Doe's capture had made him a target. Taylor had the manpower, the territory, and the strategy to strike decisively. Taylor began to consolidate alliances with disillusioned Crown soldiers, promising them survival if they abandoned Johnson. Slowly, Johnson's forces began to fray, and his position in Monrovia, once seemingly unassailable, became perilous. Taylor's plan was clear: let Johnson weaken himself in the capital, then sweep in to claim Liberia's spoils. The city descends further. Monrovia, already ravaged, descended further into chaos. Civilians fled through the streets, dodging gunfire from both rebel factions. Looting became widespread. Food grew scarcer by the day. Disease spread unchecked. Hospitals overflowed with wounded combatants and terrified civilians. Relief organizations struggled to operate amid shelling and sniper fire. Monrovia was no longer a capital, it was a battlefield, a city without law, morality, or hope. Even the once revered churches and schools were not safe. Clergy and teachers fled, leaving their congregations and students to fend for themselves. Johnson and Taylor collide. By late September, Taylor made his move. His forces pushed into northern Monrovia, clashing with Johnson's men. The battle was brutal. Both sides knew that controlling the city meant controlling the narrative, and by extension, the future of Liberia. Johnson's INPFL was fierce but small. Taylor's NPFL had numbers, organization, and resources. Each skirmish sent waves of refugees fleeing deeper into the city, only to stumble into the next confrontation. The fighting was chaotic, unrelenting, and merciless. Civilians bore the brunt of the carnage. Women and children were captured, killed, or raped. Streets ran with blood. Monrovia's skyline, once proud and bustling, was now a skeleton of buildings, smoke curling from their ruined walls. The scandalous role of foreign powers. As Taylor and Johnson fought, rumors of foreign involvement persisted. Some claimed that Nigeria's Ecomog was secretly favoring Johnson to counterbalance Taylor's growing power. Others alleged that Taylor himself received covert support from neighboring states and even Libya, which saw in him a potential ally in West Africa. The truth was obscured by the fog of war, but the whispers added another layer of scandal. Liberia's fate was not only determined by internal actors, it was also being influenced by hidden, foreign hands, each playing a dangerous game for their own advantage. The human cost. The death of Samuel Doe had not ended the suffering, it had amplified it. Families were torn apart by revenge killings. Neighbors turned against neighbors in a cycle of ethnic retaliation that escalated daily. In just weeks, Monrovia became a city where morality had no place. Survival required choices most people would never consider: theft, betrayal, or fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their back. Doe's ambition had once promised redemption, but his death revealed the harsh truth: the country had never been stable, and the seeds of violence he had sown were now fully grown. The struggle for legitimacy. Both Johnson and Taylor claimed legitimacy in the wake of Doe's fall. Johnson pointed to his capture of the president as proof that he was the rightful leader. Taylor cited his control of the countryside and his broader vision for Liberia. International observers were horrified by both claims. Neither man had a legitimate government, a constitution, or even popular support in any meaningful sense. What they had were guns, fear, and ruthless ambition. The scandal here was clear: a nation's leadership was decided not by law, but by violence, spectacle, and strategic terror. The unraveling of Liberia. By October 1990, Monrovia had become a war zone within a war zone. The city's population had dropped dramatically as tens of thousands fled to refugee camps or crossed into neighboring countries. For Liberia, the fall of Samuel Doe marked not liberation, but the acceleration of total collapse. His death was the spark that ignited decades of suffering: Taylor versus Johnson, rebel versus civilian, neighbor versus neighbor. The country's institutions, already weak, crumbled entirely. Banks closed. Schools were abandoned. Government ministries ceased to function. Liberia was no longer a nation, it was a battlefield ruled by warlords. Samuel Doe's murder had been personal, shocking, and public. But in the chaos that followed, it became just another chapter in Liberia's unending tragedy. Johnson had achieved a moment of glory, but Taylor was patient, waiting to strike. The war would rage on, consuming lives, cities, and history itself. The world would come to know Samuel Doe not for his rise, but for his fall. Not for his coup, nor for his iron rule, but for the footage that captured the final, horrifying moments of Liberia's most infamous president. What happened in that small room at the free port of Monrovia was not just murder, it was theater, propaganda, and a scandal that would reverberate across the globe. The making of an infamous recording. Prince Johnson had orchestrated the entire scene. Every detail was deliberate: the bound president, the taunting of his captors, the questions, the knives, the laughter. The recording began with mock interrogation. Johnson's men demanded confessions. Doe pleaded, promised money, offered anything in exchange for his life. "I can give you everything," he begged. "Your money is nothing," Johnson replied, calmly sipping his beer. As the tape progressed, the brutality escalated. Doe's ears were mutilated, his blood flowed, his cries echoed through the room. Johnson's message was clear: power is fleeting, and humiliation is permanent. By filming it, Johnson turned private vengeance into public spectacle. This was not just the end of a president, it was a warning, a message, a grotesque performance of dominance. Shockwaves across Liberia. When news of the tape spread, Liberia's population reacted in disbelief and horror. Many Crown soldiers mourned, unsure how to react to the man who had ruled with fear. Civilians who had once suffered under Doe's tyranny found themselves in a moral conundrum. Were they witnessing justice or pure cruelty? Ethnic tension surged. The tape inflamed divisions, giving rebel factions justification for further killings, while traumatizing ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire. Monrovia, already in ruins, became a city haunted not only by war, but by images of their former president's agony. The international community reacts. Across the globe, diplomats, journalists, and human rights organizations were stunned. Images and descriptions of the tape circulated quickly, sparking outrage. The United Nations condemned the killing. Western governments expressed shock and deep concern. Human rights organizations demanded accountability. Yet, while condemnations were voiced, actions were limited. The scandalous truth was unavoidable: Samuel Doe had once been a US-backed ally, and now the US, and much of the international community, had done nothing to stop his torture. The silence was deafening, leaving room for speculation. Was Doe abandoned? Was this calculated? Some Liberians whispered that foreign powers had quietly approved of his removal, believing that the man they once supported had become expendable. The tape, in that sense, was more than evidence of cruelty, it was evidence of betrayal. The media sensation. Even in an era before viral social media, the recording spread like wildfire. Journalists described the scenes in painstaking detail. It became one of the most notorious examples of political violence captured on tape. The video was shocking not only for its content but for the audacity behind it. Prince Johnson had not simply executed a president in secret, he had created an indelible image of dominance, shared it with the world, and guaranteed that Samuel Doe's legacy would be defined by fear and humiliation rather than power or accomplishment. For students of politics and war, the tape became a grim case study: the rise and fall of a leader, the mechanics of revenge, and the grotesque theater of power. The role of foreign powers. Speculation about outside involvement intensified. Liberia had long been a pawn in Cold War politics. Doe had been a strategic ally for the United States, receiving support and military aid to maintain influence in West Africa. After his capture, rumors swirled that certain foreign powers, aware of the brewing chaos, chose not to intervene. Some suggested that Taylor or Johnson had received tacit support, or at least a blind eye, from governments that saw Doe's death as a convenient resolution. The scandalous nature of these claims added a layer of complexity to Doe's legacy. He had been a dictator, yes, but was he also a victim of geopolitical calculation? The line between betrayal and war strategy blurred in the minds of many observers. Moral and ethical outrage. For human rights organizations, the tape symbolized the depths of cruelty a civil war could bring. Questions arose. What was the responsibility of foreign governments in preventing atrocities? Could the world have acted to save Doe, even knowing his record? The video also sparked debate inside Liberia. Some communities celebrated, seeing a tyrant finally humbled. Others recoiled in horror, recognizing that the methods used were no better than the oppression they had suffered under Doe. It became clear that in Liberia, justice and revenge were inseparable, and morality had become a casualty. Legacy of the tape. The footage immortalized Samuel Doe's death in a way that no history book could. It was a reminder that power is fleeting, that paranoia and brutality often precede downfall, and that vengeance can eclipse justice. For Prince Johnson, the tape secured infamy and fear, elevating him in the hierarchy of Liberian warlords. But it also painted him as a man without mercy, a brutal figure who used spectacle as a weapon. For Liberia, the tape was a scar on the national consciousness, a reminder of how quickly a nation can descend into chaos when leaders govern through fear and vengeance. Cliffhanger ending. Samuel Doe was dead. The tape ensured that his death would be remembered, not for leadership, not for ambition, but for humiliation. Yet the war continued. Johnson's victory over Doe was only the opening act. Charles Taylor still waited, patient and ruthless. The Civil War would rage for years, drawing Liberia deeper into chaos, corruption, and tragedy. With Samuel Doe gone and Prince Johnson having claimed his gruesome moment of victory, one might think the Civil War in Liberia had reached its climax. Far from it. The real storm was yet to come, and its name was Charles Taylor. Taylor had spent the months following Doe's death consolidating power in the countryside. While Johnson flaunted his dominance in Monrovia, Taylor built alliances, recruited fighters, and secured resources. Where Johnson thrived on spectacle and fear, Taylor operated with patience, strategy, and a vision to seize Liberia entirely. Taylor's strategic patience. Taylor's genius lay in timing. Rather than immediately attacking Johnson, he let his rival expose his weaknesses. Johnson's forces, small and overstretched, had taken control of parts of Monrovia but lacked the organization to hold them. Meanwhile, Taylor negotiated with disillusioned Crown soldiers, former government officials, and opportunistic civilians. He promised them survival, wealth, and positions in a new Liberia. Slowly, the tide turned. Johnson's followers defected. Supplies dwindled. Morale collapsed. Taylor understood that brute force alone would not win Liberia. He needed legitimacy, alliances, and control over the narrative. And by late 1990, he had all three. The collapse of Monrovia. Monrovia, already shattered by the fighting between Johnson and Doe's remnants, now faced the inevitability of Taylor's advance. Taylor's NPFL forces poured into northern and western districts, clashing sporadically with Johnson's INPFL and looting what remained of the city. Civilian casualties mounted. Entire neighborhoods emptied as families fled into refugee camps or across borders into Côte d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone. Hospitals, schools, and churches, once sanctuaries, were abandoned, destroyed, or repurposed as bases for armed factions. The city had become a ghost, a symbolic prize for warlords, its infrastructure and population paying the ultimate price. The decline of Prince Johnson. Johnson, once the conqueror of Samuel Doe, now faced his undoing. His reputation for brutality could intimidate, but it could not compensate for his strategic disadvantage. Taylor's forces, larger and better coordinated, systematically weakened Johnson's hold over Monrovia. Johnson fought fiercely, but each battle drained his manpower and resources. Allies defected, realizing that Taylor's victory was inevitable. By early 1991, Johnson's influence was confined to small pockets of the city, while Taylor moved to consolidate control over the rest of Liberia. Taylor consolidates power. Taylor's rise was marked by calculated ruthlessness. Unlike Johnson, who thrived on spectacle, Taylor preferred subtler methods, targeted assassinations, strategic negotiations, and the absorption of smaller factions into his NPFL army. He presented himself as the solution to Liberia's chaos, a man who could restore order, though only under his rule. By portraying himself as the lesser evil, Taylor won over communities exhausted by violence, as well as regional powers eager to see stability restored without direct intervention. Taylor's consolidation was both political and military. He established a network of checkpoints, controlled critical supply routes, and installed loyalists in towns liberated from rival factions. Slowly but surely, he became not just a warlord, but the dominant force in Liberia. The international response. International powers watched with growing concern. Taylor's NPFL was accused of atrocities rivaling those committed under Doe. Reports of massacres, forced conscriptions, and ethnic-targeted killings poured in. Yet foreign intervention remained limited. Nigeria and the broader ECOWAS coalition maintained a peacekeeping presence, but their efforts were constrained by limited resources and the sheer scale of the conflict. Western governments, wary after Doe's controversial death, offered condemnation but avoided military engagement. Taylor exploited this vacuum. While the world debated morality and legality, he expanded his power unchecked. Liberia's fractured society. Taylor's rise did not restore Liberia, it reshaped it into a fractured, war-torn nation. Communities were split along ethnic and political lines. Trust was obliterated. People moved in fear, never knowing whether neighbors, soldiers, or rebels would protect them or kill them. Economically, the country collapsed. Banks were looted, markets destroyed, and foreign investment vanished. Agriculture suffered as civilians fled the countryside, leaving fields untended. Liberia, once rich in natural resources and a hub of commerce, teetered on the brink of total collapse. Socially, trauma became the common language. Survivors of Doe's massacres, Johnson's vengeance, and Taylor's campaigns carried scars, both physical and psychological. The war left no family untouched. Taylor versus Johnson, the ultimate rivalry. Though Taylor consolidated control over much of Liberia, his rivalry with Johnson lingered. Johnson, still controlling small areas of Monrovia, sought to rebuild his influence. Skirmishes continued, and the tension between the two factions ensured that Liberia remained unstable. Taylor's advantage, however, was decisive. With better organization, larger forces, and external support, he gradually pushed Johnson into corners, isolating him and reducing his capacity to act. The eventual outcome seemed inevitable. Taylor would emerge as Liberia's dominant figure, but the cost would be enormous. The scandalous legacy of Doe's death. Looking back, Samuel Doe's death had been the catalyst for all that followed. His capture and torture had set off a chain reaction of violence and ambition. Johnson's temporary triumph, the spread of the infamous tape, and the ensuing chaos allowed Taylor to manipulate Liberia's fractured landscape to his advantage. Doe's removal did not bring peace or justice, it created opportunity. And in that opportunity, Taylor rose to power, cementing his role as one of Liberia's most controversial and ruthless leaders. By the mid-1990s, Liberia was firmly in Taylor's hands, but the country remained a nation at war. Johnson's influence, though diminished, lingered like a festering wound. The Civil War had left Liberia divided, traumatized, and scarred beyond repair. By the mid-1990s, Charles Taylor had established himself as Liberia's dominant force. Samuel Doe's death, Prince Johnson's brief moment of notoriety, and the chaos that followed had created a vacuum Taylor skillfully filled. But the nation that emerged from this inferno was fractured, traumatized, and scarred in ways that would take decades to address. Liberia's descent was complete, not just politically, but socially, economically, and morally. Taylor consolidates power. Taylor's rise was methodical. He leveraged a combination of military force, political alliances, and intimidation to dominate the landscape. Former factions, including remnants of Johnson's INPFL, were either absorbed into his forces or neutralized. Taylor's strategy was twofold: eliminate opposition and create the illusion of legitimacy. He established administrative structures in territories under his control, installed loyalists in key positions, and presented himself as the savior who could restore order. Yet, Taylor's version of order was brutal. The same tactics that had allowed him to overthrow Doe and survive the Civil War, forced conscriptions, ethnic targeting, and violent suppression, became the backbone of his rule. Fear, rather than respect, became the glue that held Liberia together. The collapse of institutions. Liberia's government, already weakened by Doe's authoritarian rule, never recovered. Ministries were either defunct or controlled by Taylor loyalists. The judicial system ceased functioning effectively. Police forces either disbanded or pledged allegiance to one warlord or another. Public services, healthcare, education, and transportation collapsed entirely. Roads became dangerous corridors, schools were abandoned, hospitals overwhelmed or looted. Liberia's citizens were left to survive on their own in a country where infrastructure no longer existed. International intervention and the limits of aid. By the mid-1990s, the international community attempted to intervene. ECOWAS peacekeepers, UN observers, and humanitarian organizations worked to stabilize the country, distribute aid, and negotiate ceasefires. But the effectiveness of these interventions was limited. Peacekeeping forces were stretched thin, rebel factions were unpredictable, and corruption rampant. Taylor's strategic positioning meant he could manipulate foreign powers, presenting himself as a partner for peace while continuing to consolidate power. International observers condemned the atrocities, but Liberia remained a nation where justice was elusive and survival dictated behavior. The shadow of Samuel Doe. Even years after his death, Samuel Doe's influence lingered. The infamous tape of his torture became a symbol of the country's descent into cruelty and vengeance. It was replayed, studied, and debated. For some, Doe remained a tyrant whose death was justice served. For others, his humiliation highlighted the moral bankruptcy of the rebels who had claimed his life. Doe's rise and fall illustrated the tragic paradox of Liberian politics. Power achieved through violence is often temporary, and the methods used to maintain it invariably create the seeds of future destruction. Prince Johnson's legacy. Prince Johnson survived Doe's capture and continued to control small territories in Liberia. His reputation for brutality, cemented by the infamous torture tape, made him both feared and reviled. Johnson became a warlord who thrived on infamy. Yet, despite his notoriety, he never achieved Taylor's level of control. His legacy was defined by spectacle and revenge rather than political strategy, serving as a cautionary tale about the limits of raw brutality in the pursuit of power. Taylor's Liberia, a nation in pieces. By the late 1990s, Liberia's landscape had been reshaped by decades of conflict. Cities lay in ruins, villages abandoned, and infrastructure destroyed. Ethnic divisions deepened, fueled by cycles of violence that began under Doe and intensified during the Civil War. Economically, Liberia was devastated. Trade had collapsed. Foreign investment vanished. The once productive agricultural sector had been abandoned. The country's natural resources, including timber and diamonds, were exploited by warlords to fund militias rather than to build the nation. The social fabric of Liberia was shredded. Trauma, displacement, and mistrust became the norm. A generation grew up knowing only violence, fear, and instability. The moral scandal of Liberia's descent. One of the most controversial aspects of this period was the role of the international community. Critics argue that foreign powers could have acted to prevent Doe's torture, stabilize Liberia after his death, or hold Taylor accountable. Instead, Liberia became a proxy battlefield for regional ambitions and global political calculations. Neighboring countries, regional coalitions, and even Western powers intervened selectively, often prioritizing strategy over humanitarian concerns. The moral scandal was undeniable. While Liberia's people suffered, the world largely watched, debated, and reported, but did little to stop the carnage. The lessons of a nation torn apart. Liberia's story is both tragic and instructive. The rise and fall of Samuel Doe, the spectacle of his death, and the ensuing chaos demonstrate the fragility of governance built on fear. Leaders who rule through violence leave nations vulnerable to the same brutality they wield. Taylor's eventual dominance was not the triumph of governance, but the continuation of a cycle initiated by Doe and perpetuated by revenge, ambition, and opportunism. Liberia's civil war showed how quickly societies can descend into chaos when power is pursued at the expense of justice, morality, and human life. Liberia's long road to recovery. Even decades later, Liberia's recovery remains ongoing. Institutions rebuilt slowly, and the country faced immense challenges in post-war reconciliation, economic redevelopment, and societal healing. Yet, the scars of Doe's death, Johnson's spectacle, and Taylor's rise remain etched into Liberia's collective memory. They are reminders of what happens when leaders rule through fear, when revenge becomes policy, and when the world turns a blind eye to unfolding atrocities. The final reflection. Samuel Doe's death was not the end, it was a catalyst. His capture and torture set off a chain of events that reshaped Liberia forever. Prince Johnson's brief infamy and Charles Taylor's calculated rise demonstrated the cruel logic of power in a society under siege. Liberia's descent into violence was scandalous, controversial, and deeply human. It reflected the dangerous intersection of ambition, vengeance, and geopolitics. And most importantly, it left a lesson that reverberates far beyond Liberia's borders. When leadership is built on fear and brutality, collapse is not a possibility, it is a certainty. Closing thoughts. As Liberia struggled to rebuild, the ghosts of Doe, Johnson, and Taylor lingered. The nation's story serves as both a warning and a chronicle of human resilience amidst horror. The death of Samuel Kanyon Doe was only the opening act. The civil war that followed exposed the deepest fractures of society, the consequences of unchecked ambition, and the perilous path a nation can take when justice is abandoned. Liberia's journey continues, but the lessons of this dark chapter remain indelible.